started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marley Townsend, and I am the Communications Coordinator at the League of American Bicyclists. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Shifting Winds, What New Federal Priorities Mean for Biking. We know this is a timely and important conversation, and we're really grateful to have you all here with us, whether you are here as part of an advocacy organization, representing a metropolitan planning organization, or simply someone who cares about the future of biking in your community. So just a couple of quick reminders. This session is being recorded and it will be added to our YouTube channel and to our webinar archive at bikeleague.org/webinars. All attendees are muted, but we do want to hear from you, so feel free to chat. But if you have official questions for our presenters, please drop those into the Q&A function, and we will get to those during the moderated Q&A at the end of the session. A quick accessibility note that closed captions are available, so please feel free to click the CC button at the bottom of your screen if that helps you follow along, especially because we know federal policy can sometimes feel like an alphabet soup, lots of acronyms and jargon. So don't hesitate to use the captions or ask clarifying questions. That's what we're here for. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to take a moment to introduce the League of American Bicyclists. The League is the nation's oldest grassroots bike advocacy organization. And for more than 140 years, we have been working to build a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. From the Good Roads movement in the 1880s, where the League advocated for the first paved roads so that people could ride bikes more safely, to our work today, our mission has always been rooted in improving lives and strengthening communities through safer and more accessible bicycling. And that's why we're hosting this conversation today, to help local advocates and organizations better understand what's happening in Washington, how it affects bike-related projects, and how we can move forward together. We are joined today by several experts who bring deep knowledge and valuable insights into federal transportation policy and its impact on local projects. So first up, we have Katie Economou. She is the Legislative Director at the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or AMPO. She leads their federal policy and government affairs work, advocating for the priorities of MPOs with Congress, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and partners across the industry. Katie brings a background in local sustainability and planning work, public engagement, and community data initiatives. She holds degrees from the University of Michigan and the University of Delaware. Next, we have Corrigan Salerno, who is a policy manager at Transportation for America. He's worked on everything from policy research to constituent advocacy, and notably, as a research assistant at Leidos, he supported the Federal Highway Administration's Human Factors Lab and contributed to updates in the latest MUTCD, or Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. Corrigan is originally from Southern California, but now resides in Washington, D.C., and holds a degree from George Washington University. And moderating today's discussion is Caron Whitaker, the League's Deputy Executive Director, who leads our federal policy work and will help guide today's conversation through some of these complexities that we're all trying to navigate. And with that, I will hand it over to Caron.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I feel like in the last 2 or 3 months, things have been happening so fast, from the first day of the Trump administration when they first paused transportation funding to the National Bike Summit, where on the morning of our Hill Day, we found out that bike infrastructure was being flagged and projects with bike infrastructure were being held. That it's just been crazy, and I feel like I'm constantly sending out messages like, this just happened, or do this, or talking to local governments about a specific project. I thought it'd be helpful to take a minute and pull back and sort of put things in context and hear some other perspectives. So I'm really grateful to Corrigan and Katie for agreeing to be here. And these are some of my colleagues outside of the Bike League that I work with all the time and talk about these things. So I'm excited to have you hear from them. And then I'll come back after their presentations and we'll do a larger discussion. As Marley said, if you have specific questions, please put them in the Q&A. But we're leaving the chat on if you want to make a comment or talk to other participants or anything like that. But for me as a moderator, easier for the questions to be in the Q&A. So thanks, everybody, and I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thank you so much. And share my screen real quick. Okay, slides all good on my end. Excellent. Is that? Well, hi everyone. I'm Katie Economou. I'm the Legislative Director for the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or AMPO. And I'm based in DC. I've been with AMPO for about 2 years now, and I just wanted to say thank you to Caron, to Marley, and the League for inviting me to be on here today and share a little bit about what's going on at the federal level and specifically how this impacts regional governments. Just a little bit of background about AMPO. We're a membership-based nonprofit that supports metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, through advocacy, training, research, and leadership development. Big picture is we're here to support MPOs both nationally and locally. And a little bit more background. There are 410 MPOs across the country, all with unique geographies and structures. Our go-to phrase is, if you know one MPO, you know one MPO, because they all operate really differently. They change based on their region, local, and state context, but they share a common mission for planning for transportation, meeting federal requirements, and delivering on regional impact. Should also mention on this map, the purple areas show the boundaries of MPOs nationwide, and the red and green clusters, if you can see my mouse here, those are the urbanized areas with populations above 200,000. And if you're interested in taking a little bit of a more deep dive, you can scan the QR code and it should pop up with an interactive map and you can find which MPO represents your region. So backing up a little bit with a really quick MPO 101, MPOs are federally required regional planning and policy-making bodies. They guide long-range transportation investments, and they coordinate across local governments, transit agencies, state departments of transportation, and the public to create different multimodal plans using federal performance measures. Each MPO is governed by a board of local elected officials, and it's staffed by transportation professionals and experts. They serve areas with populations above 50,000, and they help ensure that federal transportation dollars are used effectively, informed by local priorities, and aligned with national goals. And also, other thing up here in the top right-hand corner, we have a full MPO 101 guide if you want to take a deeper dive. MPOs are required to produce core planning documents that outline current and future transportation projects and programs to meet current and projected community needs. This includes, I think Marley mentioned acronym soup, so bear with me here. This includes the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or MTP, which sets the long-range vision for the region, and it also includes the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, which lists out all the programs and projects funded within the region on a shorter time horizon. But I wanted to pull this slide to show a little bit about the funding. Federal funding, mostly from the Highway Trust Fund, or HTF, makes up the bulk of MPO budgets. Every 4 to 5 years, Congress passes a big reauthorization bill like the IIJA, and that sets funding levels and policy. Then the Highway Trust Fund dollars flow to the state departments of transportation by formula, and a small portion is then suballocated to the metropolitan planning organizations. At the MPO, these projects are then listed into the TIP, which I just mentioned, and guided by the long-range metropolitan transportation plan. Then the local governments go on to implement those projects. So just a tiny bit of background there. But MPOs receive funding through 2 types of federal formula programs, planning and capital. All MPOs receive planning funds, and TMA, or Transportation Management Area, TMA, MPOs with populations above 200,000 are directly suballocated certain funds on the capital side. And listed them all out here if you want to take a peek, but most MPO funding comes from these formula programs, but they're also eligible for discretionary grants like SS4A and RAISE, which help supplement and fill gaps in formula funding. So MPOs are simultaneously local, regional, and federal creatures. So understanding their role in handling federal transportation funds is super important, especially as Congress is approaching reauthorization, and there's been lots of shifts occurring at the federal level. So I promise I'm done with the background. So to the good stuff. State of play, federal landscape, things are shifting super rapidly, and that's across the administration, Congress, and the courts. The administration is using executive orders, memos, and rules to redirect priorities, pulling back on areas like DEI, energy, and climate. And at the same time, they're also going for cost cutting and streamlining initiatives, especially things that we see from the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, that are being elevated. Recent executive actions from recent executive actions and USDOT changes are pretty much reshaping transportation policy and funding as we know it. These shifts are already creating a lot of uncertainty, and MPOs have experienced a lot of ripple effects. So on the USDOT side of things, there's been significant changes in response to those executive orders. A couple key things to watch. New guidance is expected soon, including on how USDOT intends to apply the executive orders to all the programs and policies within USDOT. Notice of funding opportunities or NOFO updates should start to align with the executive orders. Those are coming out. There's major staffing changes that are happening as well. Many staff in the agency have opted for the deferred resignation or retirement program, FORK as many know it. There's also a reduction in workforce or RIFs that are beginning this week and will continue through May. These changes are raising a ton of concerns, specifically about slower reviews, potentially delayed guidance, and a loss of institutional expertise. And this has left a lot of our members, MPOs, uncertain about funding timelines and program stability. Also, should flag from FTA, we've heard that the RIFs are expected to be broad and large. And from what we've gathered from the MPO experience is that the deferred resignation program and the past wave of RIFs as well that initially happened have depleted staff and resources within division and regional offices. Example here, I heard from one MPO that they had lost an entire team of folks in their division office that manage environmental reviews. So we're starting to see issues there. Another action that has caused a lot of uncertainty is USDOT's review of unobligated discretionary grants. I know Caron touched on this at the beginning, but this process is already underway. We've heard that the modal administrations like Federal Highways and FTA, they've completed their initial reviews and now it's being elevated to the Office of the Secretary, or OST. It's still unclear how OST is going to proceed with this, whether it's going to be targeted modifications on grants or broader project scrutiny and waves of cancellations. Ahead of Secretary Duffy's hearing in Congress, USDOT urged staff to expedite grant execution, especially for infrastructure projects that were aligned with the administration's priorities. On our end, we saw a wave of approvals in some of the Environment and Public Works Committee member states. That's where he was testifying just before the hearing. Since then, it appears that the grants are held up again. And this has left a ton of MPOs in limbo without updates. Some MPOs have received like no updates at all on the status of their grants, while others have only heard that they're still under review. And as a note here too, on what we've heard, the review is specifically just on unobligated discretionary grants, and keywords flagged in the guidance on the reviews like bike infrastructure were flagged like bike infrastructure. However, we haven't seen that those projects have been specifically targeted. We're closely tracking this process. To my knowledge, no formal cancellations have been reported yet by MPOs for any grants, but it's still early days, so we're keeping a really close eye on this. These reviews have caused a ton of confusion for MPOs and certainly in the short term have resulted in delays, as MPOs and local governments are kind of in a holding pattern here. They're unsure about how they can proceed with work on these grants. So of course, delays can translate to future increased costs and shifting project timelines. And there's always the fear that this can jeopardize projects from being done on time and also on budget. So with all the uncertainty surrounding these reviews, we've been encouraging MPOs to reach out to their regional and division offices on the status of their grants. And we're also having them check with their local partners on the status of their grants so we can keep track. We're also encouraging folks to take a look at some of the statutory language that's tied to the programs they've received grants under and start documenting where things align and providing justifications. And I can share this link in the chat, but we created a statutory language guide to help out with this. And we also have a full write-up on the grant reviews, which I'm happy to share. So SS4A, so for Safe Streets and Roads for All, I know Corrigan is going to dive deeper into this, but I wanted to flag one big thing that we're tracking. In the new fiscal year 25 NOFO, USDOT now defines underserved community using the statutory definition of area from the area of persistent poverty definition. That shift narrows eligibility, especially geographically, and limits what data applicants can use to demonstrate community disadvantage in relation to safety needs as well. Previously, the definition was much broader. The last administration used things like EJ screen indicators, which touched on areas like race, pollution burden, income, Justice 40 goals as well, and a range of other criteria like language access, health disparities, so on and so on. But the concern is now that MPOs and local governments applying for implementation grants must show that their project area is in an APP designated census tract or county. And plus, like the NOFO still requires a completed comprehensive safety action plan if you got planning funds in the first round. And many of those were developed under the old framework. So there could be a risk that well-planned projects, especially, may not qualify under this narrower definition with the new NOFO update. So with that as well, like we've heard concerns from MPOs about the disconnect too between the real world safety needs and these new eligibility thresholds. So wanted to flag that. Responses to federal change. There's so many moving parts right now, and we're also starting to see MPOs adapting in a few really interesting ways. To respond to this in the immediate, we've seen folks trying to use more neutral language in their planning documents and grant applications to avoid some of those trigger words under the recent executive orders. So terms like DEI, environmental justice. And we've had tons of different listening sessions on how MPOs can still best serve their regions and fill on national goals and local priorities, and how we can continue doing good work despite all these barriers coming up from the federal government. So other thing that we've been advising is maintaining communications with local and state partners to identify risks and flag potential delays so that we can communicate that with our partners on the Hill and also sister organizations and collaborate together. And also some MPOs have begun to develop contingency plans in case of federal slowdowns or any kind of funding disruptions. On the info side too, we're working on creating different tools to track these things. We have a litigation tracker. We've been hosting regular listening sessions, like I mentioned, to share challenges and start brainstorming on solutions across regions. We've been providing a ton of policy updates and analysis on how these federal actions could affect MPOs. And we've been sharing tools like the statutory language guide I mentioned. But I believe that's all I have on my end. Also have a couple links that I'll drop out, but monitor questions in the chat.
Okay, and as Corrigan gets his slides ready, I just want to really recommend Katie's updates, which I think you can sign up on the website, right? And we'll send a link, but she does a really great job of synthesizing the information in a way that's helpful. And I see we have some questions. We'll get to that after Corey.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Katie. That was a really good roundup of a lot of crazy different events, but I'm going to probably take us back a little bit further just to contextualize what's kind of going on in the grander scheme of things. So this kind of feels a lot like it's unprecedented, but in reality, it is precedented with what the Trump administration is doing and what it's done in the past. It's just at a scale that's not really been done before. So, for instance, at Transportation for America, we were tracking U.S. Department of Transportation's actions in the first term from 2016 to 2020, when they were doing a lot of delays to the transit program. We had a report called Stuck in the Station, and we tracked how the US DOT was slow rolling obligations for these federal discretionary funds for transit. We even were at such a bad point that we had to create a cheat sheet for folks to decode what US DOT meant when it was actually saying things, whether or not they were allocating funding or awarding funding or announcing funding. But that actually kind of ties into some of the problems that we're in now with the current administration holding on to some of these funds that Katie had mentioned earlier. But to continue to go on in these differences, we're seeing a real big reprioritization in alignment with what the USDOT did under the previous admin when they switched over what was known as Tiger grants, which were very similar to RAISE grants and what kind of funding they awarded to build grants, which stands for Better Utilizing Investment to Leverage Development Transportation Discretionary Grants Program. And if that doesn't make sense as an acronym to you, it's because it really doesn't. A lot of the acronyms in transportation are like this. But under the Tiger program, you saw that there were significant investments in projects that were multimodal, serving transit, serving complete streets, but also some investment in roads projects. Under the first Trump administration, you saw them have a huge uptake in road-specific projects at the expense of complete streets, transit, and even in many cases, freight-centered projects to move goods around where there are freight bottlenecks. So it's not really surprising to see a lot of the things that the USDOT is doing now, but it's being done in a much more chaotic way with a lot less certainty and at a scale that we did not expect. So, for instance, as a scale issue, in the first 24 hours of the Trump administration, we saw about $1 trillion frozen for several hours out of what seemed to have been a confusing executive order. Later that month, just a week or so after, U.S. Department of Transportation's new secretary, Sean Duffy, implemented 2 major memos that essentially implied that they were going to be canceling $30 to $40 billion worth of projects that were out of alignment with the U.S. Department of Transportation's new priorities that they outlined. And the types of projects that USDOT considers outside of their priorities are pretty basic projects like sidewalks, bike lanes, and transit, which has been around for a much longer time than car infrastructure, for instance. But in that case, Katie framed this memo up very well in the step-by-step breakdown, but USDOT is now breaking, according to an internal memo that was leaked, they are reviewing grants for unobligated discretionary grants. So an unobligated awarded discretionary grant is, in this case, funding that the Biden administration may have announced previously before the administration's transition. And despite that announcement, there was no specific signed agreements yet. Funding isn't out the door. It's still kind of in limbo, but the communities are expecting that funding. And we're still waiting on the full impact of what that might look like, and especially at the speed that Trump administration is even reviewing grants or when the certainty might start to come. This is a terrifying chart just on how far we are into this administration and how much has been done in less than 6% of their time. But it's really too early to say specifically where we're at on some cases. But for instance, on Safe Streets and Roads for All, in the 2 months that the Trump administration has been there, they've obligated $8 million. Under Biden, they had about 30 or so months with the funding, 23 with the awards, and they obligated about 100 or 13 million per month. But you can see there's kind of a bit of a drop off in terms of how much funding they're awarding in this kind of February, March period in the winter when obligations kind of slow down. And this isn't really the case for federal highway formula funds, however, where you see a consistent, relatively obligation to projects, and those formula projects are really more so aligned oftentimes with the U.S. Department of Transportation's new stated goals. They're often focused on car-centric projects around road capacity or road resurfacing and reconstruction, that sort of thing. So getting into the eyes of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we'd mentioned the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. And as we know, that's very much oriented towards safety for vulnerable road users like bicyclists and pedestrians. So between the previous administration, 2.9 billion or so of funding for awards were announced. However, only about 519 million of those grants have been obligated so far. So really a small fraction of which means that there's about $2.3 billion in limbo with the Trump administration potentially reviewing those grants, with it unclear on the nature of those grants. Now, we're not sure if they're canceling them outright or how the scope of these grant awards are being changed, but that's still a significant amount of funding with a lot of uncertainty. And we're already seeing delays affecting folks' decisions on what to do with their money as awardees. So taking a look at what that impact might mean, we did a review of some of the literature going back to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act on the job creation benefits of infrastructure projects, specifically active transportation like biking and walking. And we found that the literature has kind of shown that these are very good at producing jobs, especially relative to average projects or those without active transportation elements. And that's important because when projects like those under the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant are delayed, it's really costing recipients money that they can't really afford to lose for several reasons. Because right now, in this spring to summer period, a lot of localities will need to be sending this funding out to contractors and bidding it out so they can actually begin work on the physical infrastructure. And if you can look at the really scary graph on the right, that very high vertical dip right there is inflation for highway cost construction. So as time goes on, things are only going to get more expensive, and some communities may not even be able to finish the initial scope of the project if their federal awards aren't obligated in time and they're able to begin work under a quick basis. So taking a look at those old project figures, project to job figures, and then adjusting that to these current levels of inflation, we found that of those billions of dollars and millions to communities that the Trump administration is holding right now, you think that there is about 5,480 to 6,560 jobs potentially held up that could be created directly and indirectly from funding under the Safe Streets and Roads for All Act program. And of that, 1,200 are going to would be going to rural awardees, and 4,200 would be in urban communities. So this is something that would be impacting the country on a pretty even basis on both rural and urban communities. And this assumes that we have a third of the purchasing power of what we did in that initial study, and then also that these are some of the most least cost-effective projects that the study evaluated for bike infrastructure. So this is really not giving us a lot of favors for the job creation, but it's still thousands of jobs that could be at risk. And it's true that it's already having an impact. So just within the last week, we saw a project get canceled in Ann Arbor, specifically with federal funding, because of these delays and this level of uncertainty that's kind of permeated the government. And it's being very difficult for localities now to deal with this. And then just briefly about the new notice of funding that the new DOT has released. They are aiming to apply new principles for their analysis of new grants. That's yet to be defined, but they focus on centering awards around families, but that's not necessarily defined, as well as communities with higher birth rates, I believe, and again, not defined. So we'll see how USDOT implements that. Further, in the NOFO, there's some new discussion on how projects will be scored with if they have any reduction of vehicle capacity. The maximum award was reduced from 10 million to 5 million, but we also saw that there might be some easier processes to submit for safety plans if it's addressed in earlier plans that the communities have developed. And then Katie had mentioned the different maps with the areas of persistent poverty. This is a map of the counties. I can drop this link here in the chat on the census tracts. So this would be able to be used to define whether or not certain tracts or counties are in these areas of persistent poverty. But as you can see, based on these counties, it's not exactly as comprehensive as the initial or as the previous administration's maps talking about disadvantaged communities. But anyway, I'm gonna hand it back over to Karen. But yeah, this is not just jobs. Obviously, this is more than jobs, and this is extremely important for the public health and also general physical safety. So thanks.
Okay. Thanks. I'm gonna ask, I'm gonna talk a little bit about discretionary grants and then we'll get into formula grants. So if you had a formula question, we'll get there. I just wanted to start with this one question about, is this legal? Like, is it legal for the administration to change contract agreements for grants? Especially if they were based on congressional criteria included in legislative authorization. So
Corrigan?
there's a couple of different terms in there, I think.
I want to preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, I think none of us are lawyers.
Yeah.
Unless Katie, you're a lawyer.
I can take a stab at it.
Sure.
Also, I want to add the disclaimer that I'm also not a lawyer. But I think it's a really important question and one that a lot of folks are asking right now. In terms of grant agreements, like once a grant agreement is fully executed and the funds are obligated, from my understanding, it becomes a binding contract between the recipient and the federal government. So at that point, I think it's extremely difficult for the administration to unilaterally change the terms or call back funds without a specific statutory reason. Where we've seen more uncertainty is with announced but not yet obligated discretionary grants, of course. Like that's the gray area. Those awards haven't been finalized through a signed agreement in some instances. So technically the agency still has some discretion under those terms of the NOFO. But from my understanding, once the funding is obligated through a signed grant agreement, funds are flowing. To my understanding, the administration is bound to honor those terms, but lots of rumblings around that. Corrigan, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, exactly. They definitely have a bit more authority to change funding that's been appropriated and how that goes out. So if Congress has this set of money set aside for them, they now have some authority to choose who receives it on the competitive grant basis. But looking retroactively at those that have signed things, they don't really have that ability. But like Katie said, there is a gray area for those that have been awarded but have not signed.
Okay. And then I wonder if you can give an example of something that where there was statutory language and then there was the notice of funding, or the part where they start asking for applications where maybe the notice of funding went a little further than the statutory language.
Yeah, I think a good example, since we're talking about SS for A, if you look to the SS for A NOFO, there were some additional factors added that folks could address. Like, I believe one of them was workforce development or wealth creation. And that wasn't specifically outlined in the statutory text that Congress wrote. So that's another area of a little bit of disconnect between the NOFO and the what's in the stat language by Congress. So I would think that areas like that, should that be incorporated, might face more scrutiny from the administration as they're conducting those reviews in comparison to something that Congress like very explicitly listed out.
Okay, yeah. So I ask that because that's sort of one of the things this administration is going back and looking at, right? Is what did the Biden administration ask for in a NOFO versus the statutory language? Have either of you seen something like this before, where an administration has stopped a project going forward that the old administration had awarded?
So this kind of happened a bit, like I mentioned at the beginning, just with regards to transit projects under the first Trump administration. That was more so really slow walking the grants and taking their time to get that funding out the door more so. And those were, for the most part, funding agreements that have been signed or given full funding grant agreements under the Obama administration. So it's pretty similar in that case that this has been done before, but again, the scale of this and that at that point mostly extended to transit and multimodal grants, but now it's really across the board. Also partially because there's just so many programs under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Yeah, so I also got a question about, do you think this is a strategy to delay the funding? Like, how is that affecting, Katie, your members, or Corrigan, T4 has members there, local governments? What are they most concerned about with the delay? And what is your advice to them on projects that have been awarded?
So I can take a quick stab at this, but whether or not it's a strategy, there's definitely an effect in that one, communities are afraid to really put forward their own funding for these projects that they know are not in direct alignment with this administration's priorities. So it is having the effect that they're less likely to use their own money for the projects that they're hoping to use because they know that by having it on the books or by having some federal funding attached to it, that might delay that funding, tie it up, and change how other funding that's been budgeted is affected as well. So our advice, though, really to communities that are kind of in that jam is to continue to really communicate these impacts to Congress. And we'd encourage you to really cite specifically the projects that have been affected. We've seen that different projects have had some luck after being championed by members of Congress. For instance, a senator could tell Secretary Duffy to advance a project, and that might actually get it moving. So a lot of this, I think, is being driven by a culture of fear of being singled out by the administration, specifically fears of retaliation. But I think, Katie, I don't know if you want to expound on that more, just having worked with more practitioners or.
No, I think that's an accurate read on the uncertainty itself, creating fear and putting local funding behind it. I mean, MPO specifically, we're federally funded, so it's kind of a different instance, but absolutely, I think the uncertainty behind the funding actually coming through is creating a lot of hesitancy, and that itself can create real delays. I think your mention of spotlighting the importance of these projects continuing and raising that with congressional delegations is beyond important right now. And also speaking to the benefits that this actually delivers to the community, how many people are impacted by it, why it matters is super important right now, not only for protecting the programs themselves, but also just spotlighting that transportation funding is not bipartisan. We very much need this for our communities. Being able to bike, walk, get to where you need to go safely is of the utmost priority to everyone, and Congress needs to know. So definitely keep elevating this.
And then what advice do you have for communities who are looking at the new opportunity? USDOT is soliciting applications for Safe Streets for All right now, but we know there's a bunch of changes, right? And we said they're looking at the new DOT's priorities. We've definitely seen some creativity from local governments, and like, I'm just wondering what your advice is, or what things have you seen that you thought like, oh, that's a good idea?
That's a good question too. I think the basics stay the same. Tie the project closely to what the program statute calls for and connect it back to your region. This is the MPO advice. Connect it back to your regional priorities and also be sure to mention those national goals. We're encouraging MPOs to adapt some of their language depending on the program. Like for RAISE, as an example, might help to frame your project in terms of national or regional economic impact, and then still maintaining all the actual purposes of the program. For SS4A, leaning more into the crash data and local safety planning, whatever was outlined in that NOFO. So I think tailoring is super key right now, and it's definitely not a one size fits all moment, but as much as you can do to adapt, I think we have to be creative with it, especially language wise, because one other thing I'll mention on the MPO side, there's also reviews for their core planning documents, and we've seen certain keywords be flagged, and it's kind of an exercise of reframing or refocusing those things and scrapping the keywords if that's going to delay your tip or your MTP from being approved, like if there's a way that you can change that language.
Yeah, and so we had a question at the very beginning about tips. Can you talk a little bit more about that review and if and how it's affecting bike infrastructure?
Absolutely. So for the review that's happening right now, this is standard, like all MPO's products get reviewed by their FHWA division offices. But what's new with all the orders and executive orders that have come out is that everything that happens with federal funding needs to align with these executive orders. And what's really tricky is there hasn't been super explicit guidance on this yet. A lot of the guidance that our MPOs are getting in terms of how to adapt their plans is based on verbal guidance, and folks have gotten a list of keywords, and the direction behind it is take a look at your plans and see if these keywords are listed. If they are going to be dinged during reviews, so you'll need to modify for that. But it's not, we don't have a full picture right now because these reviews happen at different times and we're seeing a couple rounds of folks go through with it. There's definitely consistency with some of the terms that have been flagged. And I have a write-up on this too that I can share with everyone if that's helpful. That has some of the keywords, but that's where we're at right now. We're looking to get a more full picture as more folks undergo reviews. But this is completely separate from the discretionary piece as well. And your question on bike infrastructure, I haven't seen that as a keyword flagged. I mean, MPOs also operate with formula funds, and that's different than discretionary as well, that many of those eligibilities are within the formula programs. Like you can use go to TAP for bike infrastructure. So I don't think it's possible. Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think it's possible that they could roll back on that, especially for planning programs and what's listed in the STIP and also for the MTP.
Okay, so yeah, so now we've switched into those formula fundings, which make up about 90% of the funding. But to go back to that, the advice about asking Congress, there was a question about what is Congress doing to try and hold the administration accountable for legislative mandates? And who are they listening to, especially when we're seeing DOGE out there cutting jobs? What are some of the implications for the next transportation bill in Congress?
So I think that really is the key question right now, is figuring out who Congress is willing to listen to if they're not really willing to stand up for themselves and their own ability to control funding. The administration now is able to choose which kind of projects it wants to fund, and it seems to be there hasn't been a lot of consequences, but in reality, there has been instances where you can directly point to people's advocacy around projects or issues and see that it has had an effect of getting those projects back on track. And sometimes it's not just the necessarily the DOGE issue. DOGE is addressing the federal workforce for the most part, and that has huge knock-on effects to the economy that really cannot be understated. But when it comes to Congress, they're not necessarily, unless it's in their district, they may not feel as strongly about it as they might feel about other projects that are directly being advocated to them by their own constituents and also other elected officials that they work with at the local level. So, and that's historically been a good way for projects to move forward on the behind the scenes basis. DOGE right now is acting very flashy, but a lot of these projects and this funding, there's a chance that you can work around those issues by working with your elected officials and convincing them and working to get them to address it at the federal level so that it doesn't necessarily blow up in a flashy way, but could be resolved. And then also just on transportation reauthorization, there's still a lot of questions about really the role of the federal government as a whole and its ability to control this level of funding. If this is going to be par for the course, what should Congress do if the administration will generally choose what projects it wants to award? Because if the next administration, looking at who's campaigning now, in Utah takes control of the federal government, will the House Republicans or Senate feel satisfied to have that new White House in control of this funding to this level? So would they enjoy highway funds being canceled at this rate? So maybe there will be a shakeup to the transportation bill, but we'll see. I doubt it's going to be that extreme, but there could be.
Okay. Yeah, so I also think there may be an opportunity just moving into the next reauthorization to respond to this, which Corrigan, you touched on a little bit. So going back to formula funding, there was a question that said they've heard rumblings about the administration going after formula funding. We haven't seen that so far. What mechanisms are out there where they could do that, or that we should be watching for just in case?
Maybe this reminds me of the stip and tip review issue. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but that was thankfully resolved.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So in terms of the formula funding, like as mentioned, it's statutory, so it's a bit different in a way. Also, like with the discretionary programs as well, like USDOT has more great name. USDOT has more discretion to do things with the awards for it, so that's a bit different. But on formula funding, I think what Corrigan just mentioned, the example of the tip and stip issue, this dates back to if you go into the analysis, I have another link out to it. USDOT had flagged that they were going to take a look at all planning documents for state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations and go in and do a full review all the way up to the Office of General Counsel in USDOT. And while this wasn't directly on the federal funds themselves, the formula funds, it was reviewing all the documents that enable those funds to move. So having that additional layer of review was essentially a pause on the programs. And luckily they walked that back because a lot of noise was being made about how this will essentially stop all transportation projects. But that is a mechanism that the administration does have at its disposal, the pauses and the additional layers of review that we've seen come up time and time again. So I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Are either of you worried about rescissions? And just a quick definition of what a rescissions bill is. This is something that the White House can send to Congress to say, we're going to pull back authorized funds. So I'll just,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Do you want to add? I
think I would. Yeah. It's we actually just saw, I think, the first rescissions bill sent from the White House, or a list of projects. There's about 40-ish days, I think, left for Congress to act on it. It's not necessarily related to transportation. I think they're mostly on government funded communications, public affairs, things like PBS. Yeah, that could be coming up in the future, and of prime interest for our work is, and actually I should have interjected on this with the formula funding. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program is a formula fund program that actually is being frozen by USDOT and has been frozen for a while now, but it's a little different in that there was a specific plan that each states have to submit annually to get approval to spend that money down, and USDOT unilaterally canceled every state's plan. And as of now, they claim that they are awaiting, or that they are constructing new guidance to deploy the funding more efficiently. But it could just be that the timeline for this new guidance comes in before the kind of timeline for rescissions. So a rescissions package that might include something like electric vehicle infrastructure funding might get drafted up before any new guidance to actually spend it down comes out for states. And that was around $4 to $5 billion remaining on spending for EV infrastructure.
Yeah. So let me see if I can clarify this. So the funding that is formula now, the US DOT doesn't have a lot of control on stopping right now. So that's what Katie was saying about TAP and the other formula programs. The ways they can slow it down is maybe slowing it down through the planning, through getting the planning certified. This isn't what we just talked about with rescissions, is a way that the president could push Congress to do something like that. So that hasn't happened yet on transportation, but it's something we all have our eyes out on it. But what we're talking about now is sort of pulling back funds has mostly been the discretionary programs.
With the exception of that one. But
With the exception
we'll
of
see.
NEVI.
We'll see if that expands from there.
And okay, there was a question, can obligated funds be rescinded through a rescissions bill? But I don't believe so, but I'll throw it to both of you as well.
I am not an expert on this. I think also because we haven't had a rescissions bill and I forget how many years it's been. It's been 12 years. Someone told me this recently. I was like, oh. So I think everyone's a little bit confused on how it's going to play out. I'm not sure. I wouldn't think so, but I'm gonna do some Googling. Good question.
Yeah. The other thing is we haven't seen a real appetite from this administration to pull back obligated funds.
It would be a political night. I mean, there's many nightmares going on, but I think that would be a political nightmare.
Yeah, or I should say at least within transportation, we haven't seen that.
Mm.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, so we've talked about discretionary funds. We've talked about formula funds. Looking forward, we have, or I'm just going to ask a question about budget reconciliation since that's been in the news. And we just heard today that the House Transportation Committee is looking at talking about reconciliation in a couple of weeks. Do you worry about that at all in terms of the things we've been talking about today?
It's definitely on our radar at Transportation for America. It's interesting that both the Senate and the House's reconciliation bill proposals were not too aggressive on transportation related pieces of the federal government's budget. So there's that, but it definitely is still a part of the concern. And we look at things like the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that's been paused, and that could be part of the programs that they look to cut in the future as a result of it. So yeah, it's definitely framing our advocacy there. And it's a point of concern for these programs.
So we've talked about a lot of different R words: reauthorization, which is the 5-year bill, rescissions where they could try to pull back other funding, and then this reconciliation. Can you rank them in terms of most important? Second, I know I'm giving them questions that I did not warn them about. Or is there one that is definitely number 1 or one that is definitely number 3 on that list?
Was reauthorization included?
Reauthorization, yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna rank reauthorization as number 1 because I think that's somewhere where in this space we can all be very proactive. We know that the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee just opened their portal for stakeholder submissions for the process. That's somewhere we continue to build our advocacy and we can start mobilizing people to share how we can protect important funding, how we can improve the program, how we can improve the process. I do think that there's hope for process change, and I think that transportation is still a bipartisan issue, and there's a lot that we can work on here. In terms of the ranking the others, what was it? Rescissions, oh gosh. I
Rescissions and reconciliation.
rescissions and reconciliation. I'm trying to think about timing on
Okay.
this one. So I would put rescissions and then reconciliation.
Okay, but reauthorization is number
Number
one.
one.
Corrigan, any same?
Yeah, about the same. I think I would swap it out so that reconciliation is a little bit higher than rescissions. But yeah.
Okay. And then last question, moving forward, we have a lot of advocates on the call. We also have a lot of local governments. What advice would you have for them if they're thinking about getting better policy in reauthorization, given what we've talked about and the directions and the confusion coming from the administration?
I think so looking towards policy improvements in reauthorization, I think a lot of the reason why we're all in this situation is because the policy we had under the Biden administration really did not allow for a lot of this money to be spent down very quickly. And that does kind of play well on both the Republican and Democrat side for reauthorization. So looking forward to finding ways to improve the deployment and speed of projects and building up the states and the federal government's capacity perhaps to actually deploy those projects at speed is one potential thing that we could look forward to in terms of policy improvement and reauthorization. I don't know if I addressed the full question there though, so let me know.
No, that's great.
No, I think that was great. And on the reauthorization piece, I think that this moment has shown us a lot. And also with the importance of having good statutory language. So it's going to be a fine-tuning process, but something that we're working on the AMPO side and also with some of our sister organizations in the Local Officials for Transportation Coalition or LOT Coalition is taking a look at how we can ensure that not only funding but also decision-making authority is available for local and regional governments so that we can continue doing good work and making sure that community priorities are being met and that these funds are protected. I think the best advice is just to continue your advocacy, work with your local partners, work with your MPO, work with really great organizations like the League here, work with T4A, reach out to AMPO, anything that we can do to spread the message.
Yeah, all right. So thank you, Katie. Thank you, Corrigan. We have your questions, and I know I've seen folks putting a lot of resources into the chat. We'll try to gather all those, and we'll send out the recording, the slides, and then those resources going forward. But yeah, thanks everyone. It's a really confusing time, and we really appreciate you hanging in there and helping us work through this. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
folks.